All right, hello and welcome to the March edition of Fraud in the News. Today we're going to talk about a major fraud involving a psychic and the Department of Justice's elder fraud sweep, some big stories in the auditing world, and of course the college admission bribery scandal you may have heard something about recently. And after the main stories, stick around for the kind of news of the weird fraud stories we like to bring you, including you can find out which body part a person cut off as part of a fraud scheme. And as always, some bad puns to finish it off. So today I have the pleasure of being joined by Jacob Parks. Jacob, you want to tell everybody what you do for us here?
Sure. I'm in the legal department at the ACFE. I'm Associate General Counsel. So I handle, we're a small legal department. We just handle everything that walks through the door legal-wise for the ACFE. A lot of contract review, trademark infringement, copyright infringement cases that we have to stop people from using our trademarks, copyrights. I also handle, I'm the liaison to the Board of Regents for disciplinary matters involving our members. So I'm involved with investigating those and receiving those complaints and things like that. So just kind of a jack of all trades legal approach for the ACFE.
All right, so just jumping right in, there was a big elder fraud sweep by the Department of Justice. Jacob, you want to talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah, so we saw a very interesting case. It was a nationwide elder fraud abuse case. And so this is a big consumer fraud case, and it's kind of reflective of what I think might be a turning point in consumer fraud that led to this prosecution. So the case involved about 260 defendants, so from lots of different states. Over half of states were involved in this sweep that happened, and it was a joint work between federal agencies and various state agencies to try to round up some of these people who are just committing consumer fraud, particularly elder fraud, over and over again. And so involved 2 million victims, so that it's just a huge net was being cast to attack these people who are particularly vulnerable to fraud. And it involved about $700 million worth of stolen assets. So this was one of the biggest consumer fraud cases ever, and definitely the biggest concerted elder fraud sweep that we've had so far. And part of the reason that this was possible, part of the reason that this came about, is that there was recent federal legislation, the Elder Fraud Prevention and Prosecution Act, which was enacted in 2017 specifically to enhance the prosecutor's ability and prosecutors' attention to consumer fraud. Because I think in the past it's been a lot of education, but what this act really wanted to get at was that there are people committing these crimes that have been getting away with it for too long. So what their attempt was to divert more resources to prosecutions, to give more powers to prosecutors, to encourage more interaction between agencies to prosecute these types of crimes. And so I think this is the biggest fruit of that legislation so far, is that we've had this huge case where there were a lot of victims, a lot of defendants, and so I think this is a good step in the right direction. It kind of proves that this legislation has been successful so far.
Yeah, and it's transitions nicely into our next story, which is an example of a kind of scam that targeted the elderly specifically, along with sick people over decades, and that was also a consumer fraud scam involving famous French psychic Maria Duval, in which sick and elderly people would receive what appeared to be handwritten notes with personal details and signed by the psychic. And apparently they had gotten, the people carrying out this scam had gotten that information about the victims from suckers lists sold by companies known as data brokers. And anyways, it was run by a number of different companies. The primary one was registered in Canada, and over several decades, the scam brought in more than $200 million from over 1 million victims in just the U.S. and Canada alone, although it was a worldwide scheme. And So it'd been going on for a while. They tried to shut the scam down a couple years ago, but just now are actual official charges being filed. Two Canadians made some pleas. I don't know if it was guilty or some kind of plea bargain, but then the supposed boss of the company or mastermind behind the fraud was arrested on an Interpol warrant in Spain, and he had just been kind of operating this scheme remotely in different European countries, and ultimately faces 18 counts of mail and wire fraud and conspiracy to commit mail and wire fraud and money laundering, and he is awaiting extradition in Spain. And so there's not really a big takeaway for our members or people interested in fighting fraud, other than that it's just noteworthy for being a good example of elder fraud. And it's one of the biggest and longest running consumer scams ever that's apparently heading towards some positive resolution here.
Yeah, I think, if anything, the takeaway, I think, is that we are seeing a transition. I remember we used to see things like this, when I was growing up in the 90s. Queen Cleo was on TV a lot, offering psychic, a team of psychics to help you figure out your problems, and largely this was just kind of accepted. If you fall for this kind of thing, that's kind of your problem. Try to educate yourself and don't fall for that. But I think we're seeing increasingly that we're saying, no, this is not okay, and so prosecutors are actually going after this type of fraud that is costing people money, especially people who are vulnerable.
Yeah, another thing that has apparently been going on for a long time that most people just accepted was the whole college admissions scheme not necessarily being fair across the board. So I'm sure that you are aware of this story by now, but we'll talk about it a little from our perspective.
You probably know the details of this. It's kind of hard to avoid this story just because it's so interesting for a large number of reasons. It was basically what was happening is most of this was linked to a man named William Singer, who allegedly set up this foundation and this system where he was accepting large amounts of money, mostly from wealthy people, obviously, to various ways to trick or get people into colleges who probably weren't really deserving to get into some of those elite universities like Yale and Stanford and universities such as that. And there's a variety of ways that they were using to get around the admissions process. Sometimes they were bribing admissions officers. There were some instances where they were using athletics departments to designate students as recruits, so they were more likely to get into the college, even if they had no aspirations for actually playing in the sports. Some of them didn't even play the sports that they were doing, and so there was all these different ways that they were using just to get people into these schools. And it's an interesting case, I think, because it does involve our elite institutions and our trust in those institutions, and it was a lot of celebrities involved with it. I know it was a hard pill for me to swallow when I found out that Aunt Becky from Full House was involved in this. I just couldn't believe that at all. So I think the celebrity aspect of it, these are our most respected universities, and then also just that it was a different type of crime. We're used to seeing a lot of crimes against employers, crimes, people stealing from outside the organization. That's a lot of what our members are investigating. But this was an interesting one because it was a crime against the public, because it was unfair to all the students who didn't get in because they were, their place was basically stolen by people who didn't deserve to get in. And it's also a crime against the universities, because in a lot of these cases, these people are taking assets without the executives at the university knowing about it, and so they're basically betraying their employer's trust as well.
Yeah, I thought one thing, when you hear bribery or corruption stories, we tend to think about political corruption, where some kind of elected official is accepting money to steer policy to benefit somebody else. But this is a great example that bribery can absolutely be an occupational fraud scheme, and it doesn't always just have to involve politics or a politician. And one of the companies that the mastermind of this scheme that was at the heart of it was actually a nonprofit, and people funneled the money, some of the bribe money through that nonprofit, and brought tax fraud into it because they ended up being able to deduct those donations to that nonprofit that were actually bribes. So I got two questions for you, Jacob. For first, as I mentioned, the tax fraud angle, what do you think the chances are that the parents actually get hit with a tax fraud charge? Because it's kind of a weird gray area when at the time that they donated to this nonprofit, if the nonprofit was in good standing at the time, do you think they're liable for tax fraud charges if the nonprofit was at the time in good standing?
Yeah, so we'll see what happens when, innocent until proven guilty. We'll see what results of the allegations. If the allegations are true, kind of as I understand them, then I think there could be some tax implications there. So when you donate to a charitable organization in the U.S., if it's what we call 501c3 organization, it means your donations to it are tax deductible. So if they took those tax deductions, it becomes a question of how much they knew about this foundation. Can prosecutors prove that they knew it was a fraudulent donation, in the sense that they knew that they weren't actually helping a good cause, they were just helping their children to get into school? That would be pretty good evidence that they knew that this was not a genuine nonprofit. And so if that's the case, and you're saying that, look, this was just a bribe, and then you deducted that on your taxes, that would be a form of tax evasion that I could see. Now, whether they should be charged with that, I think will depend on whether they have a plea agreement. A lot of times what will happen is that they have violated all these laws, and prosecutors could take multiple angles to prosecute them. Maybe they get them for wire fraud, maybe they get them for tax evasion. It's kind of, what's up to them, what best case they can make. And even if they don't charge them with tax evasion specifically, there will probably be something in the plea agreements that'll say, okay, this money should have gone to the IRS. You shouldn't have been able to deduct that from your taxes. So that'll probably be, if they are found guilty, somewhere in the plea agreement that will be solved. They will have to pay some sort of penalty for that.
All right, and we got a couple other stories that we want to get to. For our auditors, we've got a lot of people in the audit profession in our membership, so there were a couple big stories that you might have heard. One was recently National Managing Partner for Audit Quality at KPMG was caught in participating in a scheme working with a former employee of the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, and in which they were obtaining confidential information about lists of which KPMG audits were going to be inspected by the PCAOB. And so essentially what this was is this KPMG executive got caught using inside information to rig these inspections and boost KPMG's performance in those inspections, which obviously kind of defeats the whole purpose of those inspections and crosses a number of ethical lines. And it occurred at one of the big four auditing firms, so that's certainly noteworthy, and it just really looks pretty bad for all parties involved. And then once again here, wire fraud shows up as one of the charges. And so that's, I think, every single one of these cases that we've talked about so far involves a wire fraud charge. So Jacob, from a legal perspective, you want to talk about the wire fraud charge and why it shows up in so many fraud cases?
Yeah, the wire fraud and the mail fraud statutes are interesting. They were actually passed back in the 1870s. So when wire transmissions were in their infancy, really, I don't think anyone expected back then for the scope of those laws to expand as they have. But that's what's happened because of technological advancement. So there's really two reasons why federal prosecutors like to use the wire fraud and mail fraud statutes. One is because it gives them a great way to exercise federal jurisdiction over a criminal problem. So their idea is that if someone is using our telecommunications network, whether that's a text message, an email, visiting a website, or posting on a website, these are all considered parts, a wire, so to speak, in the sense of it's electronic transmission. Or if they're using any part of our mail system, essentially what the federal government is saying is that because that involves the nation, it's an interconnected web. It's a territorial issue to where the federal government can get involved. So that's why they state laws have their own rules against fraud, but the federal government needs some sort of power to investigate and to prosecute a fraud, and so they're often going to use the wire fraud statute because it's hard to find a fraud nowadays where someone isn't sending a electronic transmission of some sort. So that's why it's so prevalent. It's also prevalent because it's basically any scheme to defraud someone using the wire. So it's almost like a general fraud statute that just happens to involve some sort of electronic communication or the mail system. So that's really why you see so many of these wire fraud cases, is because it's one of the best and most proven tactics for federal prosecutors to exercise power in an investigation.
And as far as this specific case with KPMG, it kind of remains to be seen what the ultimate fallout will be for either one of those organizations involved. Over across the Atlantic, there's also another issue with auditors and agencies responsible for supervising them. It was recently decided that the UK is going to scrap its Financial Reporting Council, which was the organization that was responsible for overseeing audit firms in the UK. And this is after a review that was ordered to be conducted by Sir John Kingman of the London Stock Exchange. This was in connection with a couple big corporate collapses in which some big auditing firms were essentially viewed as having not done their job properly. So very similar to some of the regulations that emerged in the wake of the Enron and WorldCom collapses here in the U.S. And in particular, the big four, KPMG, PwC, Deloitte, and EY, were at the heart of this review and the ultimate decision to scrap the previous oversight organization and replace them with the Audit, Reporting, and Governance Authority. So that'll mean new oversight that auditors in the UK will have to keep in mind going forward. So
one of the interesting things about this is a lot of times when there's some sort of perception of a regulatory problem, it involves some sort of amendments and we get some new processes in place at the regulator. But in this case, they decided to just completely scrap the organization and start over. So that seems like a pretty extreme change. But is there any sort of hope or any sort of indication that this regulator is going to be more successful than the previous one?
I think there's certainly a hope. I think that the new organization or new agency will be starting off based on the mandate of, hey, you got to do a better job than the previous Financial Reporting Council. And in addition to that mandate, there's some additional powers that they'll have, including requiring rapid explanations from companies in the event of accounting scandals or collapses, and the ability to order changes to corporate accounts directly without having to consult courts. And there's a few others. If it's particularly relevant to your line of work, I recommend you do some reading up on it. And another big picture kind of thing here is, this is another example of the UK tightening up regulations and laws against financial crime. Another thing, I wrote recently a column in the Fraud magazine that we put out about unexplained wealth orders in the UK and a couple of other new agencies. It just seems like they're starting to take financial crime a lot more seriously in the UK, and this is just another piece to that puzzle. And so I'm sure the hope that it will do a better job than its predecessor is there. But so now we've covered our main topics, and we're moving on to the kind of more interesting, or in one case crazier, fraud stories that we come across out there. And so This first one, remember in the intro we teased a body part being cut off, and so here's the payoff on that with Jacob.
Yeah, so we found a case where a woman in Slovenia, somehow her family members convinced her to engage in this scheme where they had some sort of health insurance policy that covered lost limbs, and so they decided it covered about $450,000 for a lost hand. So they decided that a good scheme would be to have her saw her hand off, and so they did that. And they went to the hospital and were seeking to get reimbursed for this. And they dispatched some investigators. They found the hand that they had cut off. They determined that it had been intentionally cut off. They were actually able to get the hand back to the hospital and reattach it. So not only did she not get to benefit from the scheme, but she did at least get her hand back. So.
Yeah, no word on whether or not she'll be able to fully use it, but all of that, and there's still a pretty good chance that she's going to end up having to do some time. So that pretty bad backfire there.
Yeah, it's an interesting juxtaposition between that case and the college admissions case, right? I think it's just two entirely different motivations. In this case, it was more a motivation of desperation, probably, that one person does that. In the other case, it wasn't about wealth so much; it was about a motivation of success. These people were already wealthy, but we see that the motivations for fraud are not always just greed. Sometimes they are the perception of success. So that's very important to some people. So it kind of shows the different types of motivations that can lead people to commit fraud.
And I think the perception of success was of particular importance to the star of our next story, a rapper from Detroit named SelfMade Cash. And I know Jacob's a huge rap fan here, so I picked this one just for him. But this rapper, a lot of the stuff he rapped about was stealing people's bank information, committing identity theft. He's got songs like Bins and Bitcoin, which BIN would be bank information number or bank identification number, and songs like In Swipe I Trust, Swipe School, Bins, Scam Likely, and where he's bragging he's the greatest swiper of all time. And coincidentally enough, he was arrested and charged with identity theft and other crimes, including our favorite wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and possession of unauthorized access devices. An extra little wrinkle to this, people apparently reached out to him, some of his fans, to find out how they could be like him and commit ID theft, but he sold them fraudulent information, including non-existent bank identification numbers.
True to form.
Yeah, so if there were a criminal charge for having an awful rap name, he probably would have gotten that too. But anyways, his name doesn't have much of a ring to it and is not actually factually accurate.
Yeah, it's kind of false advertising.
Yeah,
and not self-made.
No, not self-made at all. And so the proceeds of his crimes, definitely not self-made. And so anyways, finishing off with that one, that is a wrap for us here with Fraud in the News. So thanks for sticking with us, and we will see you next month.